Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Esser. I am YSC's Senior Program Manager for Research and Advocacy, and we are thrilled that you are joining us today for our Practical Matters session, Safeguarding Financial Health After a Breast Cancer Diagnosis. This program is being live streamed as well, and is part of our three-part series called Take a Stand. These live streams will be focused on legal issues pertinent to young breast cancer survivors and co-survivors, and are supported by the Judges and Lawyers Breast Cancer Alert, and we thank them for their support. So welcome, whether you are here in Pittsburgh at the YSC Symposium or watching us at home online. We are asking you to complete two surveys. The first is a pre-survey that measures your current knowledge on the subject matter. So if you are watching at home, the link for this survey is in the post itself and will be placed in the comments. If you are here in the room, it should be right in front of you, so go ahead and complete that one. At the end of the session, we will also ask you to complete the post survey, and those of you who complete both, the pre and the post, will be entered into a drawing for a $25 Amazon gift card. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, just please ask. Either raise your hand. If you want to write it down, if you're not comfortable asking the question live, that's fine. Just give it to us up front. If you're watching via the live stream, just please put your question in the comment box. And we ask that all questions be framed in a general manner. Please don't ask anything too specific. It's not the forum for a specific or personal consultation. And just ask one question at a time so we can get to everyone's questions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Julie Olmsted. Julie Olmsted is the staff attorney at Cancer Legal Care, a Minnesota-based nonprofit that helps patients, survivors, and caregivers in Minnesota with their cancer-related legal issues. Julie's legal path came into sharp focus when her mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2007. Julie witnessed the enormity of the diagnosis and its impact not only on her mom's health, but on all facets of her life. Since then, Julie has made it her practice to do meaningful work with clients in difficult situations and to make the law more authentic and accessible. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you to everyone watching on the live stream. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the financial implications and ramifications of a breast cancer diagnosis, what your options might be. We'll kind of walk through a few different areas, and please feel free at any time if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me, ask for clarification. I'm happy to make this as conversational as we need it to be because I want this to be helpful for you and whatever your particular situations are. And feel free to talk to me after if you do have more specific questions. Again, I just want to disclaim that I practice law in Minnesota. I'm not licensed in any other state, so we will be talking about a lot of federal laws today that will apply in your state, but your state may have different terminology, may have expanded or abridged protections, so we'll talk a little bit later about how to get connected to someone like me in your state. And so the main three things that we're going to talk about today are insurance. As we referenced this morning, this can be health insurance, short-term disability, long-term disability. We're also going to talk about employment and some frequently asked questions. And then we'll talk a little bit about government benefits again, so Social Security disability, what that means, how you're eligible for it, if it's right for you. We'll kind of walk through those different scenarios. So let's start by talking about insurance. So let's start with kind of health insurance because people have so many questions about this. Fortunately, or probably unfortunately in our society, it is often employer-based, which in a situation like many of you are in makes it tough if you're not able to work. What are our options here? So this will tie in a lot to the employment stuff that we'll talk about shortly, but if you do have health insurance through your employer and you're not able to work or you're taking off for an extended medical leave, they are mandated to offer you COBRA, which is an 18-month extension of your health insurance policy. They will make you pay the full premium, though. So if you're employed right now and you're paying $200 a month and you've gone on COBRA, you may notice that now you're paying $500 a month. Well, that's because your employer was eating that $300. They're not going to do that anymore. But you do have that period of COBRA, and some states do expand that protection, they can add on some time to it. If you are no longer employed or you weren't employed and you're looking for health insurance kind of in the general marketplace, there's still the Affordable Care Act, ACA, Obamacare. As I mentioned earlier, in our political climate, we don't know what's going to come of this, but right now it stands as it has been. The major benefits of the ACA are that, of course, the pre-existing condition waiver, so there are no pre-existing conditions anymore, which is significant for a lot of us, especially a lot of us who might be changing careers in between diagnoses or appointments or different situations. That can be incredibly helpful. The other major thing for people in the cancer community is that there are no lifetime limits on what they will pay for your insurance. So in some other types of insurance plans, the insurance company will only pay out up to $1 million for your claims. And after that, they just don't pay for you anymore. So you have to figure out your other options. So that doesn't exist under the Affordable Care Act too. So it definitely gets, it takes its lumps a little bit because it can be really expensive depending on what kind of coverage you're looking for. It can be very high deductible plans, which can be a lot of money at the outset. But it does have some incredibly great protections kind of wrapped into it and on the backside. Some other options that we see people working with are short-term plans and then insurance co-ops. So let's talk about short-term plans first. We had a client call a while back and he said, I just got a note from my insurance company that they denied all of this stuff because of a pre-existing condition. And we said, well, it doesn't exist. Like, what? Let's just look into this and figure it out. Well, unfortunately, in between jobs, he had picked up a short-term insurance plan to bridge the gap. So this isn't through the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't through his employer. It was just somebody else in the market. And they had a short-term, or they had a, what's the word I'm looking for? Thank you. They had a pre-existing condition clause in there that said, we don't cover it. And so his, I don't know, $100,000 in medical bills that he thought was going to be covered, it doesn't look like it's going to be covered. So as boring as it is to read insurance policy fine details, it's really important to make sure that you understand what's going on, to have conversations with your doctors to find out what the codes are going to be. I know this also really sucks, like to have to deal with this nitty-gritty stuff, but what is the code going to be? And then call the insurance company and say, here's the code. Are you guys going to cover this? And then you can do some of that stuff on the front end as opposed to worrying about it so much on the back end and wondering what's going to happen. Insurance co-ops is another thing that we see a lot of. A lot of times this is in religious or faith-based communities. They'll put together kind of their own insurance plan, like their own group insurance for a community, which has a lot of benefits, but in the cancer community can sometimes be scary because if you just have 20 people in this group and you have hundreds of thousands of dollars of claims, that's going to be an issue for the group. And they're not necessarily going to cover that. They're not also necessitated to have the pre-existing condition issue, and there are lifetime limits on those plans. Yes.
So I was going to clarify, if it's employment-based, it's definitely under Affordable Care Act. In regards to like the pre-existing.
Most likely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So really your issue would be the short-term plans and insurance co-ops.
Yes.
Okay.
If you're in a position where you left your job and you've worn out your COBRA and now you need to buy yourself something, but you're not buying it on the marketplace. Like we have MNsure. That's what our marketplace program is. Your state is going to have some variety of how to get the Affordable Care Act. If you're doing something else, something outside of that, which is harder to find, right?
That's what I was asking.
Yes.
Because I feel like most people would go through, because my COBRA is ending. Luckily, I have a job coming up, but I was wondering what I would do in regards to the middle, so that's good to know.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Exactly. Yes, so that's a good point, that the short-term plans and the insurance co-ops are a pretty small minority of what we're seeing, but they have massive ramifications if you get those and kind of don't read the policies. So we just want to make sure that we mention that. Short and long-term, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, question from online.
Sure.
Can you speak about supplemental insurance and if it is applicable for this population, specifically around supportive care? I know a lot of plans won't cover PT unless you've had a specific surgery or you only get 10 sessions.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to look into something like that rather than pay out of pocket?
Does supplemental care mean supplemental security income, or does it mean something like AFLAC?
I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
just like a secondary insurance to like cover your physical therapy or cover your
Yeah.
psychotherapy or cover.
If that's an option for you, I don't see why that wouldn't be the right approach. Yeah. Just make sure that your insurance providers play nice with each other. Sometimes they kind of overlap. Sometimes they fight about who's going to take the claim. So just make sure you have a conversation with both of them, that they work together as opposed to fighting each other. Yes.
Excuse me, quick question. Do you have any idea how it works whenever? So it wasn't when I was diagnosed. I was in between jobs, so I wasn't working. I happened to, by chance, because that was going to happen 4 weeks later, fill out paperwork to see if I could. I was going to be abroad, but I thought, oh, maybe I should just see if I can get some sort of coverage through the marketplace. So then I was passed on to the state. Thank God I was covered through treatment. But as I'm trying to figure out what's next and trying to figure out work, I can't seem to get a straight answer on what happens, right? Because you can make no money on that plan if you want to keep that plan.
Are you talking about like a state-specific government
right, so
aid
just covered
program?
Through, exactly.
Okay.
My insurance is covered through the state. And so, right, there's a really small limit. But now that I'm feeling better and want to be working, while I'm looking for full-time work, I'm doing a lot of part-time stuff. The problem is that right now I'm trying to manage window of appointments. Will I make X amount of money and then I'm going to get kicked off? And I can't seem to get a straight answer on how fast I can then sort of move into, fine, I'll pay a premium, but how fast can I move into coverage, I guess, federally versus through the state? And there doesn't seem to be a straight answer out there. And I don't know if that's just because people don't ask the question or they just don't know. Do you have any idea?
Yeah. So the question is, how quickly can I move from any sort of state aid or state assistance into like an ACA plan? I'm not sure I see what the issue is that people are having trouble answering. I mean, if you can afford to get on the Affordable Care Act, I would just do that. There are subsidies, I think, in almost every state if you don't make X amount of money. And then you can just not worry about how much you're making and being disavowed from the old program. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay, let's chat about it a little bit more after.
Sure.
And see what specifics I'm missing.
Oh yeah, I was thinking of some other issues related to that. I mean, I'm not sure that I heard a trigger qualifying event there. So would it make a difference that it's outside of the open enrollment period?
Good point. That might be part of the issue.
I work for a health insurance company.
Yeah. Oh,
I might be annoying.
yeah. No, please. And jump in anytime that you have an answer or insight too.
What is that?
So the question was, can you just jump onto the Affordable Care Act anytime you are outside of the open enrollment period, right? Because there has to be some kind of a triggering effect. You need to get a job, lose it, or do you want to speak to what
there's a number of trigger events or qualifying life events. If you get married, you might be able to be added to a spouse's policy.
Yeah.
Similarly, with divorce, that would open an opportunity for you to enroll in a different plan. Changing job, losing your job coverage. But I don't know with this situation, if you're trying to go from medical assistance to the exchange, I don't know how that works.
Right. Yeah.
If she's like getting kicked off, is that what's happening?
Right.
So
If I
say we make
make,
too much money.
if I
Oh,
make,
that sounds like a trigger.
Yes.
if I make more than X amount,
Right. If you
then I will get kicked off.
Yeah, so that would probably be a qualifying event, right? So we loss of coverage.
So I guess for you, the question is, when are you ready to make that leap, and what does employment look like for you, and when do you hit the point where you're able to afford maybe a subsidized version of Affordable Care Act? Yep. So short and long-term disability policies, a lot of times these are employment-based. Sometimes you can get them if you work for yourself. You can also get your own policies through your own providers. A lot of times what happens is if you're working and you get diagnosed, you'll need to take one of these. You'll need to invoke one of these policies through your employer in order to take some time off, which we'll chat about next. But what does that look like? How do those policies work? How does those policies work with employment law policies? But that is kind of your first option for how to take time off for treatment if that's what you need. So that kind of dives us right into employment. We're going to talk about some frequently asked questions. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the laws that protect you and some of your rights. The first question we get a lot of is, can I be asked about my health in a job interview? The sort of inverse of this is, do I have to disclose that I have cancer or that I had cancer in any job interview? We'll talk about how you can take time off for treatment but keep your job. Not always possible, but there are lots of protections in place to get you through that first hump if you just need a short-term treatment. And can you be fired because you have cancer? What do those look like? So first, in terms of health and job interviews. So the quotation there is, they cannot ask you a question like, have you ever injured your back? Or have you ever had cancer? Or have you ever had chemo? They can ask you, are you able to do this job with or without a reasonable accommodation? But in terms of whether they can ask you in your interview or whether you have to disclose in your interview, no, absolutely not. That's discrimination. They can, however, once a conditional offer is made, a conditional job offer is made, they can ask any question as long as everyone is asked that question. So those questions can be about health. If it is their standard practice to ask everybody, have you had cancer? Which is a terrible standard practice, but if that's what theirs is, and they ask everybody, then they can ask you that. There are some state laws here that might expand some of your protections. In Minnesota there are, so there may be in yours too. And that discrimination piece, let me just say too, that it deals with any aspect of your job. It's not just when you're getting hired or if you're getting fired. It's the application process. It's the training process. It's the opportunity to travel or to do networking or anything. They can't discriminate against you based on any of that. So the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, how many of you are familiar with this or have used this maybe? Good, okay. So this applies to employers with 50 or more employees, and I think it's within a 75-mile radius. So you don't all have to work in one building, but you all have to work within 75 miles. And you must have worked for the employer for a year or 1,250 hours. Your options, if you work for a smaller company or you work for yourself, are trickier. But this is the primary tool that people use for time off. So your benefits continue as if you're actively working. It's essentially kind of putting a hold on your job and saying, I want to come back to this. I expect that I'll be able to come back to this, but for now, I just need to go off and take some time. So you can take 12 weeks in a 12-month period. You can take that all at once, or you can take it intermittently. So if you need a week here, and then you can come back for 3 weeks, and then you need 2 days here based on your chemo schedule or whatever, you can do it that way. Yes.
Does that reset after a year then? Like, so the next.
Pardon?
From my experience, it seems like the answer is no, because of being told my benefits are exhausted. And it looks like it's a rolling 12-month period.
Yeah, it is not 12 weeks in every year.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a good question, though, as to exactly when it resets so that you get new benefits. I'm not sure.
I was just curious because my wife's a teacher.
Yeah.
She had it when she was in chemo, 2 weeks off, 1 week at work, 2 weeks, schedule.
Yep.
And then she's going to have another breast off this fall.
Yeah.
Just thinking ahead for that. So,
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that I had my double mastectomy in May. The following February, I had my full hysterectomy, and I was out of FMLA because it was within the 12 months.
Right,
So
and it's not 12 months January to December. It's
Gotcha.
12 months start to finish.
Thank you.
It starts. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This leave is unpaid. They may also require, they will most definitely require that you take all your time off or your vacation or your PTO at the same time. You don't get to take your 3 weeks of paid vacation and then your 12 weeks of FMLA, right? That's how they kind of protect themselves. And they must allow you to return to your job or an equivalent job. There are some exemptions to that if the company goes bankrupt or if they cut your job for valid non-cancer related reasons, non-discrimination related reasons. That may not be true, but generally this is how this program works. We have a lot of people call our office who say, okay, great, 12 weeks, that's fantastic, but like I'm not ready to return back to work after 12 weeks. What am I supposed to do? So then we often talk to clients about looking into the protections under the Americans with Disability Act, or the ADA. That's where we start talking about reasonable accommodations. So this is where you're able to work, but you need to work with some kind of accommodation. Like Maybe you can't work on Mondays because you have chemo on Fridays and it takes you a few days to recover. Can you still do your job in that 4-day work week? Can you work from home if that's easier? Do you need your reports to be in writing instead of verbally because you're dealing with chemo brain and it's hard to remember things? The reasonable accommodations piece is kind of an interactive process between you and your employer to see if that works. The main issue that we run into is that it has to not be unfair to your employer. It can't unfairly disadvantage them. So they don't have to go completely out of their way to make this work for you and have it not be discrimination. But they do have to work with you to see if there's anything reasonable that they can do. And that, unfortunately, there's no like cut and dried answer to what that looks like. It depends so much on your job, on your employer, on your skill set, on how many other people are doing that job. So it's really a case-by-case basis in terms of kind of what that looks like for folks. So can you be fired? This is predominantly for having cancer, for taking lots of time off for cancer-related issues. So if you live in an at-will state, which is what Minnesota is, I'm not sure about here, which means that you can be terminated at any time or you can leave at any time. Yes, you can be fired for non-discriminatory reasons. So having cancer it's not like some magic shield that protects you from losing your job, which you're probably all too familiar with, but it's illegal to fire you because you have cancer or because you had cancer. Just like it's illegal to discriminate against you, like I mentioned, in the application process, in any other processes like that. So yes, you can be fired like other people can be fired, but not because you had cancer. And this part is tricky, right? Because there's so much overlap here. Like you might be fired because you're doing a bad job, but you might be doing a bad job because you're in treatment and you're trying to push yourself too hard and you're just not able to do it. This is where employment lawyers kind of come in and assess the situation on a case-by-case basis and say, here's what I think is going on and here's what our options are like. The result of a lot of those will end up in some kind of a severance package or some sort of a payout from the employer if they agree that it could have been handled differently. So let's talk a little bit about some different examples of what discrimination looks like. So the first example is you don't look so great, boss, right? So you were just diagnosed and you're going through treatment, but you're still able to work. And there is a big event at your workplace and there's going to be a prospective client there. And your boss says to you, I just don't think that you should come. Like you look kind of tired. You're just not really like the face of the organization right now. Pretty clear discrimination, right? They can't do that. As long as you're a part of the team and physically able to do it and you want to, you have to be involved and invited to that. The we can't take the chance boss. So this is, you've been diagnosed, you've gone through treatment, and you're in remission, which is wonderful news, and everybody should be thrilled about that, except your boss is afraid because she has looked on the internet and seen that you have a high recurrence possibility for your type of cancer. So you apply for this position that you really want and you're totally qualified for it and you're excited. And she says, I learned this information and I can't take a chance that it's not going to come back. I can't pay this money to train you. I can't do all of this stuff. Like you're not the right fit. Of course, these are the clear-cut ones, right? Like your employer's never going to tell you that. Your employer's just not going to hire you and you're going to wonder why. So the third one is kind of the nice boss. I'm from Minnesota, where we're kind of known for our passive aggressiveness. So this is probably a prime example from our state. So this is where you think that you have a great relationship with your boss and they are super supportive. And there is a big company event and all these executives are coming into town and your boss says, you know what, you look really tired. Why don't you just kind of go home and rest, right? It's a very Minnesota thing to say. Maybe she means that, and that's nice, but there's probably also another piece that's like, you don't look well, again, with the face of the company piece, like I don't want to put you out there, this is an issue. And so that is also discrimination, if you want to be a part of it and feel like you can't. So those are some different examples of kind of what that looks like. Any questions about employment? Yeah.
Who sets the number for the minimum hours you have to work to be considered full-time or eligible for insurance benefits? Is it your employer? Is it the government?
You mean in terms of getting the benefit through your employer?
Right, for being eligible to join that group plan.
I imagine that's in the ACA somewhere. I don't know the answer to that for sure.
And that's my personal mission now. I'm digging into it to
Yeah.
see, what amount of part-time is enough.
Yeah. What's been your experience so far?
Just getting started on it.
Yeah.
I filed my ADA paperwork this week.
Yeah. A lot of times, so the question was, how many hours do you have to work in order to be qualified for employment-based insurance? I think that is going to depend on the employer. Some of them can expand the protections of ACA and offer coverage to, like Starbucks, right? Offers health insurance coverage to people who just work half-time. So I think that is something that they're able to do. What the absolute minimum is probably in the ACA. But I'll look into that. Get back to that.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
So in searching for, so I'm awesome, and I quit my job in August because life was awful, and I was like, I'm gonna do all these things, it's gonna be amazing. And then this year I started applying for jobs. My industry is very small. And so a lot of people knew I had cancer, and I could not find a job to save my life. And even people who hadn't met me, obviously I have here now, it's been 2 years. So how do you even, can you prove that you've been discriminated against because of that? Because I know some of the jobs, I was the most qualified person possible. Like, I knew that industry inside and out, and I just wasn't even getting an interview. And I really felt it was because they thought my cancer was going to come back, which obviously hopefully never does.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you really feel like that was an issue, do you, I don't know, I mean, do you go find an attorney and I feel like the discrimination is, well, no one is even worth the fight, but is that what you do? Yeah.
So the question is, if you think that you've been discriminated against, how do you prove that, and what are the steps that you take in order to try and prove that? It's hard. It's really hard. It's a case-by-case situation. It's really hard to prove that. I mean, certainly we would say document everything, right? Look at who they hired, look at your application process, get everything in writing in terms of any offers or any denials, any rejections for interviews. I would ask them feedback on why you didn't even get an interview, or ask them feedback on why you didn't get the job, and kind of have all of that in writing. And then, yes, it's an issue probably of seeking an employment law attorney in your state. But that's the tricky part, right? Because that's not going to be free.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you're in a position where you lost your job, then maybe it's worth it because you have this situation with an employer. But if you have applied to 10 jobs and you think 8 of them didn't hire you because you have cancer, that's harder. You can't take on
600.
Right. You can't take on 600 organizations.
Yeah, well, and like I said, my industry is really small. So I mean, I knew every organization I applied to in every role.
Yeah.
And so at
And
that
they
point,
knew you.
that's where it was like, okay, it's not because I don't have the qualifications or the background. And it really started to kind of feel like that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a really great website called cancerandcareers.org. I know that you're having someone from that organization at the summit in Austin who's going to speak about, I'm sure, some employment issues. But they're an incredibly helpful resource for questions like that. What do I do? What's next? What are my options?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about government benefits. So this is going to be Social Security, disability insurance, Supplemental Security Income, so SSDI and SSI. Those are different things. They both come from the Social Security Administration. So there's one commonality, but their definitions of disability are different. So go figure. SSDI is a monthly cash benefit for you and sometimes for family members. In certain situations. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but you have to meet the eligibility criteria. So because this is insurance, you have to essentially have paid your premiums over the years, which means that you have to have been paying into Social Security through working. So if you have been a stay-at-home mom for 5 years, you're probably not going to qualify for this because you haven't been paying into Social Security. They haven't been taking any money out of your checks. Yes.
Sorry, is that kind of over the course of your lifetime, or is that just in the recent past?
They look for the last 10 years. You have to have enough what they call work credits in order to do that. So you have to meet that first piece, and then you have to be determined to be disabled. And their definition of disabled is a pretty high bar. So essentially, you need to be sort of medically told that you can't work for a year or more. And so your illness is expected to last for 12 months or result in death, which is essentially if you can't work for a year because of treatment or because of your prognosis, that's when you are able to perhaps qualify for this. We talked a little bit about what those numbers look like earlier and how they're kind of tough. And we'll chat about that in a minute here. But again, this isn't the job that you had. This is any job. So substantially gainful activity means anything. Like, can you do robocalls? Can you be a telemarketer? Can you deliver newspapers? Like, it doesn't matter that it's not at the it doesn't matter to SSDI that it's not at the caliber of what you were doing. It just matters that you're not able to earn any money at all. And so once you get approved for this, and the process is you apply. I think I mentioned earlier that a significant amount of those people are denied. Then there's a second step called reconsideration. So if you're denied, then you go to the reconsideration stage. And if your motion to reconsider is denied, then you go to the appeal. And then you have like a hearing in front of some kind of a judge who kind of walks you through that stuff. So, and then if you're approved, you get that money in 5 months, regardless. Even if your prognosis is 3 months, you will get that money in 5 months. They'll backdate it to the date of your disability. But you'll get that, and then you're eligible for Medicare after 29 months of having been disabled. So then you don't have to worry about ACA, but that's a really long time, right? It's a really long time to deal with that. Yes?
I have a question about the back pay. So I was on, with my previous employer, I had to go into a long-term disability claim because I had delays with my chemo and everything. So I had to go into a few weeks of that. But like, if you're on a short-term or a long-term disability and you're getting paid through your employer, will they back pay you if you get SSDI, or does it matter if you were getting paid?
So almost all long-term disability providers will mandate as part of their policy that you apply for SSDI, because then what happens is your long-term disability provider is only responsible for paying the difference between what you were getting on long-term disability and what you will be getting on SSDI. So I think that's an important distinction I wanted to mention. I'm not sure it answered your question. Yes, as long as your date of disability was X amount of time. The issue is that if you're on long-term disability with your employer, you have to, at some point, you have to wonder if you're going back to work. So the main piece of Social Security disability is that you can't work for up to a year. So if your job is going to give you a year off on your long-term disability policy, maybe that's going to work. But otherwise, you can't be working while you're getting SSDI.
So if you work for like the government and you don't pay into Social Security, you can't apply for SSDI.
Right. So compassionate allowance list is a piece of what goes into SSDI, and it automatically sort of approves you in this one element. If you still haven't been paying into Social Security, then you're not going to be eligible for it. But in terms of does your diagnosis qualify to get you over that first hoop, there is a list. And almost all of these are, there's all sorts of other diseases, not just cancer, but almost all of them are stage 4. So if you have a stage 4 diagnosis, you are most likely on the compassionate allowance list, which means that your diagnosis is going to qualify and you're going to get approved if you meet the other criteria. And so as far as this room is concerned, if you have metastatic breast cancer, you're on that compassionate allowance list. And assuming you meet the other requirements, then you'll get SSDI. A lot of people ask, how do I apply for this? What does this look like? Do I need a lawyer? We advise, because it's fairly simple to do it online, make sure you go to ssa.gov, Social Security Administration.gov or government, because there are a ton of phishing websites out there. You'll type in SSDI and it'll link you to somebody who makes you pay. So make sure you're typing specifically into the SSA website. It's very straightforward. They ask you for a ton of information, so I'm not saying it's easy, but in terms of understanding and comprehending it, it's definitely something that you can do yourself. If you want to talk to a lawyer about it, you're certainly welcome to. Another kind of piece is, we heard earlier from some people who had applied for it and been denied, and they're just like waiting and waiting and waiting. Making sure that you're applying at the right time. So if you just got diagnosed and you don't know your prognosis and you don't know how you're going to respond to chemo and you don't know what the next year is going to look like, that's probably not the right time. because you need to be able to prove these things. You need a doctor essentially to say, like, she can't work for a year. And until you have that, there's no reason really to get lost in the system, because that's what's going to happen. Your application is going to be in process, and then it's just going to take longer overall if you eventually do meet the criteria in order to get there. Any other questions about SSDI? Yeah.
With regard to that timing it, right? I'm on short-term disability right now, and I'm starting to wonder, and I have metastatic disease. So I'm wondering, should I apply now, even though I'm hoping to go back to work part-time? Or should I wait and see how the short-term disability resolves itself first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know for certain based on your situation, but if you think that you'll be able to work part-time at any point in the next year, then I wouldn't apply for it.
I just didn't know, because it would be, I'm aware that it would be 5 months before any payment comes.
Yeah.
It would be better to be approved and then have it if I need it, or wait to start the process.
Yeah. If there is a likelihood in your mind, in your doctor's mind, in your medical records that says that you might be able to work after X happens, after surgery happens, after treatment happens, that's within a year, then I don't think you're probably going to get approved.
I mean, I can't imagine the record would say that.
Yeah.
Ongoing treatment forever.
Yeah. I mean, if that's your situation and you're stage 4, you already hit the compassionate allowance, I mean, you're probably going to get approved. But if you, that brings up a good point. If you apply for SSDI and you work while you're getting it, they take that money back.
Right. I mean, I know.
And they take all the money back that they paid you.
Okay. I thought it would just be they subtract, however much is too much that I make, they just give me that much less.
Nope. So for SSDI, the first year you're on it, you cannot work a minute and get paid. If you do that, they are going to take that money back, and they're going to take it back from jump, probably. What you can do is, after you have been on SSDI for a year, there's called a work trial period. The details of it, I don't totally remember off the top of my head, but it's like a 9-month period where you can work up to X amount of hours and kind of try that out. And so after your first year, you are able to try working and see how that goes. If you end up going back to full-time work, they're probably going to cut you off SSDI. But that's a great situation probably. If you're able to work full-time, that's probably what we're all hoping for here. Yeah, so that's kind of how that piece ends up working. All of that is pretty clearly laid out on the Social Security site. We recommend, you can definitely do the initial application and the reconsideration pieces yourself. If you're interested in going to the appeal stage, that's when hiring a lawyer tends to be a little more helpful, because that's when you're going to court, and that's where you need more documentation, and that's your end of the road. I mean, if it doesn't work for you there, then you don't get it. But up until then, there are a lot of organizations out there who just kind of take advantage of people who are looking for that, and they'll take a percentage of the money that you get from SSDI as payment. Which maybe is worth it for you, right? If you're dealing with chemo brain or other issues or a million other things going on, maybe that's okay. But just to make sure that that is how those organizations work, in case you're kind of not sure how that piece works. So this other piece is Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. This is another form of monthly payments, but it's a pretty, it doesn't fit for a lot of people. So you've got to be 65 or older, not us, totally or partially blind, or disabled. But this is needs-based income. SSDI is not. This is a situation where you need to have less than $2,000 in assets. You can own a house and a car, but you need to have less than $2,000 in your bank account if you're single, $3,000 if you're married. And then you get a set monthly cash benefit going forward. Again, like we were talking about with your state assistance, if somebody starts paying for your rent, or you win $3,000 on a lottery ticket, I mean, you're not going to get this anymore. But this is if you are in a situation where you really don't have a lot of money, then they kind of give you that cash benefit each month. You can apply for this and SSDI at the same time through the Social Security Administration. Yeah.
So 2 questions. One, is the disabled kind of part of that the same, or similar? You like prove it to doctors, and is it
right.
as stringent?
No.
Okay. And then with the income, is that how do they verify that, with W-2 or?
Yeah, they ask for everything. Yeah, just like you were, doing your taxes. They'll ask for. You'll have to sign. I can't remember exactly what the paperwork is, but you'll have to sign all of this information. They'll ask for bank statements. They'll ask for anything you have in brokerage accounts. They'll ask for 401ks, any of that stuff. They'll ask specific questions like, is somebody paying your rent? Yeah. Are you getting food stamps? You know, what are kind of all these different things?
Is there a look back period for the resources?
I don't think so. No. So I just kind of want to wrap this up with a few thoughts. The first one seems maybe a little flaky given some of the heavy topics we've been talking about, but when I say live your truth, what I mean by that is only you know kind of how you feel, what you're capable of, what you're hoping for the future, what kind of employer you have, what kind of relationship you have with your employer. So things like, should I tell my employer? Well, what kind of relationship do you have with them? Like sometimes the answer is yes. Or because sometimes you're going to get some extra care, some extra protection. But we've had lots of cases where, you know, they did tell their employer and it just turned out terribly for them. So know yourself, know your own kind of moral compass and what feels important to you and what feels doable to you. These are not all black and white things. So kind of don't feel like you have to, unless you're kind of outed because you're in a small industry and everybody kind of already knows, don't feel like you have to give any more of yourself than is necessary, even if you look a certain way or different than you did before. I mean, this is your life and your diagnosis, and you need to kind of handle that with the respect and the vulnerability that you want to, not based on other people's expectations. It's just really important to know your rights. Hopefully we have talked through some things that have been helpful for you. I think I've got handouts here that kind of walk through some other resources that are available to you. There's a ton of information online, and again with cancerandcareers.org is a lot of employment information that can be really helpful. And find your resources. National Cancer Legal Services Network, nclsn.org, is a great place to start to find organizations like mine who might be working in your area, might provide free legal care to people who are dealing with cancer or survivors or co-survivors. That's a great place to start. There are legal aid organizations in every state that might be able to help. And there are just a ton of resources available if you kind of look for them. Unfortunately, you have to probably seek them out, but they are out there. And so this is the main organization you kind of start with if you're looking for your own services there. And thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Does the Family and Medical Leave Act apply to co-survivors as well if they need to take off time to help with their loved ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. So does the Family Medical Leave Act work for caregivers? And it does, right? A lot of times people use it for maternity leave or paternity leave. So yes, as long as there are specifications of who you need to be taking care of. I'm not sure that you can use it for a friend, but if you're using it for a partner or a spouse or a mother or a sister, then yes. Yeah.
This may not fall in your wheelhouse, but do you know of any? Are there organizations that might help with sort of navigating the insurance world and like the codes and making sure that everything gets coded properly and even though like, hey, that's wrong, you should.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's a little outside my wheelhouse. I have resources in my state. What state are you in? Okay. We can look into that and figure that out. But there are, like, we work with a health insurance lawyer who does a lot of volunteer work with us and has a lot of answers to questions like that. So there may be something like that in your state. Yeah.
I mean, I could say from my employer's perspective, our member services representatives would be equipped to handle calls if you ask, under what circumstances would this be covered and how should I code it?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you have to sort of know the language. You have to know exactly how to phrase it, what to ask.
So I think the Patient Advocate Foundation actually has representatives that will help walk you through some of this.
Is that like a national organization?
Great. Good. Yeah, and I think so much of that is about being proactive. You do have to know the language, which sucks because it's another thing that you have to do, right? On top of all the other things that you have to do. But yeah, figuring out what that looks like, asking what the codes are, asking, making sure that you have your policy, making sure that you're asking the right questions, writing down who you're talking to, the name of the representative, the day that you talk to them. I mean, just keeping notes is helpful. Yeah.
No, in Columbus, I went through Riverside, which is through Ohio Health. We actually had breast cancer navigators. And so I was assigned one. And anytime I had anything like that, they were actually a great reason. Now, Columbus obviously has OSU with the Spielman and Susan Hillman and all that mess. But that was really helpful because I actually had a dedicated person in the healthcare system that I was going to that navigated. So I wonder if wherever you're going for treatment, if they would have something similar to that.
I'm always given like, oh, we're this nurse navigator, but I don't really ever understand like what they do.
They do that. They do that. Yeah. We get almost all of our clients through social workers and nurse navigators at hospitals. So they are sort of the practical side of all of the medical stuff that you're dealing with. So they can help you with that. Lots of clinics also have ombudsmans or their own kind of client representative. So there are a handful of people, whether it's, you might have to do a little trial and error to find it, but they're out there. Yes.
With the SSDI, is there a certain percentage of your income that you get when you go on that, or how does that work?
Yeah, I think it's based on what you had been earning most recently. Yeah, you might have to fact check me on that, but
I think your peak earning year is not necessarily
Yeah.
most recent.
yeah, I think that may be true.
A question from a live stream viewer. So I believe this is in regard to the Social Security disability. Applied for that, but then went back to work and got a refund after 2 years, but only for the time I was out. I'm working and in pain now. What should I do? So it's a little specific.
Yeah, so it sounds like this person had Social Security disability and then went back to work
I think so.
and is now in pain again and is curious if they can go back on
Yeah.
SSDI. Yeah, that's really fact specific, so it's hard to know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I'd say look at the paperwork that you had when you came off SSDI and kind of see what your records say now in terms of your ability to go back on it.
In general, is it possible to move back and forth between those statuses?
It's going to depend so much on your medical records. They certainly don't like to do that. I mean, it's not designed to be a fluid system because it's so, because your diagnosis has to be so strong and because you have to not be able to work for a year or more. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a few of us who are going to meet that place where we can't work for this year, but then all of a sudden we can, but then we can't again. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that exists, but it's going to be rare. Yes.
With the SSI, is that kind of similar in that they oftentimes will deny you initially and then you have to reapply?
That's not quite, no, that doesn't have that same kind of arcane process. It's a lot more fact specific. Like it doesn't matter if you're on that compassionate allowance list. It really only matters what your finances are for that.
So if you get denied, that's just...
Yeah, I think there is an appeals process there, but it's not the same sort of system that it is through SSDI. Okay. Yeah, it's not quite as cumbersome. Any other questions?
Right. Oh, I have one more question, actually.
Yes.
And this is a breaking news item, so you might not be able to speak to this. But for the last few days, and I don't know if others have seen this as well, there's been some rumblings about removing the pre-existing condition piece of ACA. And I know it's all up in the air. Do you have any advice on emotionally coping with that fact?
Yeah.
How to stay informed without becoming overwhelmed?
Yeah, it's tough to deal with the emotions of current politics sometimes. I would say to not worry about what's happening in the current news cycle. There is a lot of rhetoric that's happening without a lot of facts going on. So, you know, there were all sorts of revisions set up for the ACA that went all the way to become new law and didn't for a variety of reasons. So if we get hung up on all the what ifs and the maybes along the way, I think that's going to sap all of our energy and we're just not going to be able to maintain that. So I would urge as much as possible not to worry about it until it looks like it's going to become an issue. I am as confident as I can be that's not going to happen, but I also maybe am living in a naive reality. And if it does, that is awful, unbelievably awful. And how we deal with it then, we're just going to have to see what that looks like. but I'm not worried about it for now. And I don't want any of us to hang ourselves up on what the administration is saying, what we are hearing might happen. There's just a lot of talk that's not necessarily going to become action. So
Thank you.
thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So a big thank you to Julie from Cancer Legal Care for her valuable insights today. And for all of you who watched online, we will have another survey we'll be sending you, so please keep an eye out for that. If you're in the room, it should be there at where you're sitting. Please fill out the post survey now as well. Again, if you do the pre and post, you're entered into a drawing for a $25 Amazon gift card. The third part of our series will also be live streamed here from Pittsburgh this afternoon. It starts at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll focus on estate planning and legal documents. And all three parts of our series will be located on YSC's YouTube channel for viewing at